Hey guys, sorry about all the technical difficulties. I don't know what's going on with the school's internet here, and my work computer does not have a webcam. So it's a little bit of an older edition, so I'm going to try to answer everybody's questions that I got in the forum this week um, in a fairly quick, sort of TikTok type fashion to try to get this done. So, a lot of overlapping questions that were all really good. So far, guys, this semester, your participation in asking questions that demonstrate a really in depth, like you're definitely digging into the material, and that's great. So, in regards to Exam 2 launched this morning. I have posted a study guide. You also will get 2 attempts on this week's exam. I am asking you to not use your notes. Um, I had, it became obvious on the last exam that some people just assumed that was okay, and I'm going to ask that you do not do that. I have installed the lockdown browser so you cannot, to make it more difficult. So I appreciate if you would not use your notes on this exam. If I feel like that's not being adhered to, then we'll go to the next step and go to the proctoring setting on the next exam. So you get 2 attempts, so you can take it one time and realize where your deficiencies are, look at the study guide, go back, kind of reestablish yourselves, and then go in for that final attempt. And it will take only the highest attempt. So I am giving you that luxury. So I would appreciate it if you would not use your notes. I would hate to have, I don't want to have to fail people for cheating. Now, to the questions. A lot of great questions this week. A lot of questions about when the overlap between civil liberties and civil rights, and like what, when does that qualify? Well, that does happen a lot, especially with things like freedom of religion. One of my favorite cases is the Employment Division versus Smith case, where it talks about the two Native Americans who get fired from their work related from their job, and when they go to get their unemployment benefits, the state's like, you were fired for work related misconduct because they were smoking peyote at their Native American church. Um, and the court is going to rule in that case, for example, that generally applicable laws that unintentionally infringe on somebody's free exercise of religion are not unconstitutional. But moving forward after that, especially in the Wisconsin versus Yoder case, we see an example where a compelling interest test starts to develop, um, to where states do sometimes infringe on people's rights, especially when it comes to religion. But if the state is going to have a law that does, in fact, do that, they can't just arbitrarily have these laws. They've got to have a compelling interest in doing so. I always like to use an example of, let's say that somebody's practicing a religion that practices animal sacrifice. If they're sacrificing animals in an apartment and that violates um, regulations for the apartment building, say city health codes, etc. Preventing somebody from sacrificing an animal in an apartment building is not a discrimination on their free exercise of religion. That is a health code law that unintentionally infringes on somebody's free exercise of religion because we're trying to keep sanitary conditions. Sacrificing animals may not, coincide with that. So that's there's been a lot of overlapping questions about that. Now, what I will simply say about as we move forward as a country, groups that have been previously marginalized, LGBTQ, trans individuals, um, as they start standing up for their rights and we start seeing pushback from religious communities and other groups, we are going to see situations where it starts to overlap, where civil rights protections interfere with somebody's idea of what their free exercise of religion should be, what they should or should not have to support. This goes into things like the bakery case in Colorado from almost a decade ago now. Um, and another good example of kind of free exercise of religion conflicting with what we previously had thought is the Coach Kennedy case, where the coach at Coach Kennedy versus Bremerton School District, where he was praying privately at midfield after the games, and people started joining him, and he was, doing so. He said he argued in his private time as a private individual, but the school district had asked him to stop because the traditional interpretation of things like the lemon test are that when a coach is praying in school, or they're leading prayers on school grounds in their capacity as a coach, that essentially constitutes an establishment of religion. Um, and that violates the lemon test. Well, that's not part of where the lemon test came from, because the lemon test had to deal with school funding for secular public funding for the teaching of secular subjects in private and public schools, and that in that case the court argued that that created an establishment of religion. So if a coach is praying in what is perceived to be his capacity as a coach, then it is viewed as sort of a form of coercion for people. Like, if you're an athlete on a team and you're not religious, or maybe you are, you follow a different religion than your coach, but your coach is praying, that maybe you are feeling a pressure, you're feeling coerced to have to pray because you want to get playing time. So it's been sort of viewed as a form of coercion, and that's why a lot of times in school, when it's school prayer issues, that students are supposed to lead those, and it has to be 100% voluntary. So we're starting to see a lot of overlaps. Could a minister who does not believe in same-sex marriage, can they be forced to you know conduct a ceremony that they don't believe in? So that these issues have been bubbling up more and more to the surface as we've been going on. Another question I've been getting is, what is the difference between civil liberties and civil rights? Well, civil liberties are protections from your government. We gave you civil liberties. All your civil liberties are found in the first 10 amendments to the U.S. Constitution: freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, right to bear arms, through via a well-regulated militia, protections against unlawful search and seizure, protections against double jeopardy, just compensation for the taking of private property, things like that. All of these things, those are your civil liberties. They're protecting you from your government. Okay. Now, civil rights involve protections on the basis of a category like race, national origin, sex, gender, all of those things. Like, your government is actually actively protecting on your behalf. So that's the difference between civil liberties and civil rights. Civil liberties are protections from your government, and civil rights are protections on your behalf on the basis of a category where they are trying to prevent discrimination or protect you from discrimination. Sex and sexual orientation are now fall under the protections of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 as well, where that has not always been the case. A lot of people just assume that sexual orientation fell under that immediately, and it has not. It had to be adapted through a Supreme Court ruling a couple of years ago. So I'm going to go through a couple of these questions. I think I've answered several people's questions. Okay, questions about what cases you'll be made available, or you should have to study for. That was made available in the study guide. Okay, how does Supreme Court determine jurisdiction? Okay, jurisdiction. In the case of Roe v. Wade overturning, why did they make the decision to overturn that? I've always thought that abortion fell under this civil right to privacy. Okay, such a good question, Emma. This is such a good question. First of all, that's not a civil right. That's considered a civil liberty. So, big thing here. The term right to privacy does not appear anywhere in the Constitution. You have an interpreted or presumed right to privacy based on multiple amendments. Roe v. Wade in 1973 was decided under a woman's right to privacy, and it established what we call the viability standard, meaning that since a fetus cannot live outside of a woman's body in the first trimester, they basically, in Roe v. Wade, said that a woman had a right to an abortion up through the first trimester. What happened last summer or last year in the Dobbs case is that they essentially overturned Roe v. Wade and said that states now have the right to determine access to abortion, how long, when abortion can be restricted, etc. So what is happening is that more liberal states, or states with more liberal governance, they are either passing amendments to their constitutions to protect abortion rights. They're passing laws to protect abortion rights, or and in more conservative states like Texas and right here in Georgia, they have gotten very strict standards have been imposed. So as of my last review of this, Georgia had a 6-week or a heartbeat ban, meaning that once a heartbeat is detected, abortion is no longer allowed. Also, another thing that is occurring is that there is a movement now, especially in states like South Dakota, under Governor Kristi Noem, to prevent Plan B or any pills or any prescription-based abortion treatments. They're trying to restrict those, and that creates an interesting confrontation between the federal government and state governments. Because those are FDA approved medications that states are trying to deny to people. So that's getting really going to be a really interesting, and that's going to end up in the courts. So that's what happened in Roe v. Wade. They did not take away. They basically kicked it back to the states, and now states are in fact either eliminating or severely restricting previous standards of access to abortion care. Okay. Okay. Okay, let's see it here. Okay, can our civil liberties and could the Bill of Rights ever be taken away? Absolutely. I say this all the time to my face-to-face classes. Um, our institutions are only as good as the people we put in them. So whether or not something can be overturned or removed, sometimes that would fall to Congress, or sometimes that would fall to the Supreme Court. You need to go back and look at the history and some of the horrible rulings we've had, like Dred Scott, or rulings on the rights of Native Americans that the Supreme Court has brought down, and where they're basically saying that, African Americans are not citizens. They do not enjoy the same rights and never will enjoy the same rights as citizens of the United States. Horrible racial language, and that came from the Supreme Court, and that was the institution at the time because of the people that we had in that institution. So Americans often live in sort of a fantasy land that we're protected from these things for some reason. No, we're not. If we allow our institutions to fall under the control of individuals with no integrity, no understanding of this country, or no respect for other individuals in this country, we can easily lose rights. They can easily be taken away. If you get enough people on board, you can start getting constitutional amendments that change fundamental principles, because the only way to really change the Constitution is to amend it. So, yeah, we're only as good as our institutions and the people we put in them. Okay. Now, there was one really good question about the Westboro Baptist Church case where they were protesting at the funerals of soldiers. And, there was a question about how somebody's rights to peacefully bury their son without being protested against, how the Supreme Court decided what they decided. And, as revolting as the behavior is in that case, the Supreme Court will if the Supreme Court believes that the speech in question is political in nature, they will defend it and defend the right to engage in that speech, even when it is hateful or it's advocating for the overthrow of the government. Hopefully you have read and studied at this point Brandenburg versus Ohio, which is in the material, talks about imminent lawless action. The Westboro Baptist Church case is particularly upsetting because of the context. But essentially, if it's political in nature, now can speech be regulated to a certain extent? Can protesting be regulated to a certain extent? Yes, it can, but you can only regulate protests equally. So if you have two opposing sides, so let's say at the funeral you have the Westboro Baptist Church, and they're saying the horrible things that they're saying, and then you have people who are trying to support the family. You can move those protests to a better location away to where they're not having as much of an impact on the funeral. You can do that. But you have to do it equally to both sides. You cannot discriminate against one group based on their content. I actually know this for a fact because I showed up at a funeral of a veteran back in 2010 to protest the Westboro Baptist Church showing up because it was where I was from, and originally in Asheville, North Carolina. I actually showed up to support the family of a veteran who had died, and Westboro Baptist Church had released a statement saying they were going to be there and they were going to protest. And the local municipalities had moved all non-family members directly involved in the funeral to a location really about a half a mile, well, it was about a quarter of a mile away from the actual funeral, but they treated both sides equally. So supporters of the family had to be on one side of the road, and the Westboro Baptist Church was supposed to be on the other side. And after all that effort, they didn't actually show up. So, um, guys, I'm going to have to stop here. I've got to go teach a class real quick, but I will be releasing a part 2 of this video, and I will finish answering the rest of the questions.